Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen, and I might have COVID. Fun times around these parts. Funny thing, I'm waiting on my PCR results, and this morning I started watching Anna Wallace Johnson's booktube video in which she says that she is sick and she isolates and she reads books. I haven't finished it yet, so I don't know if she actually confirmed had COVID, so I don't know, I'll link it below, but she's amazing. But I realized she has a Blue Yeti and she was holding it in her video, and I was like, this is a vibe. I always put it on my tabletop. I've had a whole debacle this year trying to figure out how to work this damn thing, and so I'm gonna try this. This is fun. I feel like a jazz singer, with the big microphone, you know what I mean? Yeah, and so I feel like stuffy and congested, just a little like run down, nothing too bad. I am fully vaxxed and boosted, baby, so hopefully that's saving me from the full plague of Omicron. But it's giving Omicron because I can taste and smell, thank God. Thank God. Anyway, so today, what am I talking about? So I thought I would go into the 10 best nonfiction books that I read this year. I looked at my stats and I realized that I read 25% nonfiction, 75% fiction, which was kind of surprising. I mean, I feel like that's more nonfiction than I thought I read, but I am a fiction lad. But I do want to talk about the books that I read that were nonfiction because I really loved them. I had a really good time reading them this year, and they all slapped. So let's just get into it. First up, in no particular order, I'm going to save my favorite two for last, but otherwise these are just at random. I have CQ by Kristen Radtke. This is a graphic essay nonfiction. Of course, I'm filming a nonfiction video, but it is a graphic essay that is all about loneliness in America. And this book, one, called me out, two, scared me to death, because Kristen looks a lot at the effects of loneliness on us and how Americans have a inclination, I guess, to be isolated, or on the other hand, how certain cultural things make us lean that way and towards wanting to be more alone and by ourselves and isolated. And when people are forced to be alone, what that does to people, and just the health and psychic impacts of loneliness on us. And this was a really bleak book for me to read because with the pandemic, loneliness is quite, it's a bigger thing right now than even before the pandemic. But even before then, people still had an inclination for loneliness. Sorry, my brain is like not together today. So I'm just gonna go for it. I'm winging it. Bear with me. Just really had a good time with that. I thought the art was beautiful. I don't usually read graphic novels or essays. I rarely ever read graphic nonfiction. And so I learned a lot from this. It scared me and also made me want to be a little bit more cognizant of my own introvertedness. It makes you think a ton about your own behavior, people close to you, people that are more, isolated or introverted themselves, what that means for them and their health and all the implications that come with that. So loved that one. Okay, next up, this is a book I just finished like 2 nights ago. It's These Precious Days by Patchett. This book made me cry the hardest out of any book that I've read this year. It is a collection of essays about writing and about Ann Patchett's life, how she grew up knowing that she wanted to be a novelist and her path to being a writer. Also, the kind of core of this collection is about a friendship that she gained through Tom Hanks. And so it was a really interesting, long essay about how one day she owns a bookstore called Parnassus in Nashville, and they send her a ton of arcs and galleys. And I guess Tom Hanks wrote this short story collection. I don't know when it was. I think it was a couple years back. And she, on a whim, picked it up. She was kind of judging it going into it because she was like, Tom Hanks writing short stories, like, he's an actor, is this going to be good? And I guess she was blown away by it. And then they did an event together due to her loving the book. And then she met Tom Hanks's assistant named Sookie, and they became incredibly close. What the essay really looks at is how, amidst the beginning of the pandemic, Sookie ended up living with them for a while, and she had recurrent pancreatic cancer. The essay is a lot about Ann Patchett having this new friendship, yet that's constantly under threat of losing it due to her battle with pancreatic cancer. And you see their friendship blossom in the ways that Ann Patchett so clearly loved this woman. By the end of the story, she has since passed, and just reading the ways that Ann Patchett reflects on this relationship, even right now, I'm like trying, I don't want to cry, but it just really moved me. And so, yeah, wow. I didn't think I was going to be crying at the gig today, but it was just really, really moving and just made me think a lot about. The title is very apt. It's called These Precious Days, really thinking about this whole collection is rooted in death and our purpose here on life and trying to find joy and happiness amongst our friendships and in our professional paths. I just loved it. It was really, really beautiful, and I love the 2 novels that I read from her as well. I've read The Dutch House and Commonwealth, and both are excellent. She's just like a magnificent, very clear, precise, and generally like warm and happy writer. I feel like she often in her own presence from like interviews that I've seen, and also in the way that she puts pen to paper. She is very just like warm, understanding, and wise, I find, through her writing. So next up, I have Empire of Pain by Patchett, Radden, Keefe. This is one that I did mostly on audio, and I really, really enjoyed it. It is basically an investigative reporting journalism book about the Sackler family, but more so than just looking at the opioid crisis, which is, at the center of this novel. It is really looking at the family and what led them to be so dismissive and truly just disgusting in their response to the crisis, and how greed kind of altered their brain to the extent that they actually didn't think that they were liable for anything. Like, they were really just like brainworms to the fullest, did not think that they were liable, put all the blame on people that were addicted to OxyContin, and basically said like it's the addict's fault, like it's them, not us, that are pushing this product and making a gajillion dollars from it. I think Patchett, Radden, Keefe reports on this topic in such a well-researched but really succinct and respectful, even though they don't really deserve respect, but he feels like he's never trying to throw immense digs at the family. He's just being very truthful, and the story kind of tells itself at how poorly this family has engaged in the response to what they created and the greed that ensued, and their personalities and all of like the interpersonal entanglements that they had, how that all played into the greater crisis at hand. So I really want to read more of him. I think he's an excellent reporter, and he also narrates the audiobook, and I just loved his voice. He has a really good narration, and so I recommend that one on audio. It's quite long. It took me like 2 or 3 months to get through it. I would like pick it up in between books and when I was driving, and so I just kind of let it be like a podcast style book for me. Next up, I have Field Study by Sebree. This is a book that I feel like is criminally underread and underhyped this year. It came out, I think, in March, I want to say, from FSG, and I really, really love this. It is basically a prose poem told in fragments, deeply rooted in Black womanhood and desire and longing and love. And also, so basically what this book is Sebree doing like a field study of herself while trying to be objective and analyzing herself and her psyche, while also ruminating on, Black thinkers who informed her work. And so this is told in a ton of fragments in which she kind of has this amalgamation of her own thoughts on her relationships, on herself, being a Black woman, and thinking about that through different lenses in terms of art and literature, and reflecting on relationships that she's had. And it really just turns out to be this very brief but incredibly insightful and moving examination of one woman's mind, and her trying to parsing things in a way that is objective but is inherently something more through her trying to objectively examine herself. It seems like an impossible task when you yourself have your own bias about who you are, and just seeing her grappling with that on the page in a really succinct and gorgeous writing style, told in fragments, which don't often work for me, but this one did very, very well. I just think this book should be read way more than it is. Gorgeous examination of Black womanhood, and I just love the way that she did it in such an original way. So love that as well. Also, the cover is just gorgeous. Next, I have Jane by Maggie Nelson. Actually, in Field Study, she references Maggie Nelson a couple times, and very similar style here, I think. Jane is an examination by Maggie Nelson of the murder of her aunt, who passed away or was murdered in the 60s. She was a law student, and so this is Maggie Nelson examining the effects that this death had on her family and herself. And it's also interspersed with a bunch of diary entries from Jane, and those were the most moving parts of this book for me, is just seeing Jane's innocence and thoughts and hopes for herself that is cut short due to her tragic murder. The ways that Maggie Nelson tries to examine how this has impacted her when she didn't know her well, I think she only knew her until she was like 5 or 6. So she doesn't know her too well, but she knows that the effects that had on her family were stark. She combines poems, newspaper articles, and Jane's diary to create this collage, in a sense, of Jane, and crafting a book that's completely dedicated to her. I just thought it was so moving. It was my first Maggie Nelson, and I loved it. Next up, I have Consent by Vanessa Springora. This is a book about a woman thinking on her past when she was a young teenager and how she was groomed by a much older French writer. And so this book is a deep look at social complicity in pedophilia, particularly in French society at this time, and how she feels deep anger and resentment at the people around her, including her parents who knew about this and didn't really do anything to protect her as a young teenager who was groomed by this man who wrote about pedophilia very openly in his, advocating for it in his writing, and how French society did not really condemn him for this. So when I was reading this, Vanessa Springora writes in a way that is so cutting towards this man, basically just like lights his ass up on the page and really takes back the narrative for herself, while also holding people around her accountable for how they basically didn't treat her well through this, of course. And so this one is very, very hard to read, of course. Trigger warnings going into this for sexual abuse, but I thought the way in which Vanessa Springora examines this and, using something so immensely tragic to deliver this beautiful piece of writing was just, it blew my mind. So I highly recommend it if you can stomach some of the more horrible aspects of the book. I do think it's worth your time. Next up, I read Disability Visibility, which I also loved. This was a book that I did on audio, and it's a collection of personal essays from various disabled writers. I love this book for it purely existing, and I learned so much from different perspectives. I think this book is so rewarding because, one, I don't think books on disability are published enough, and I think this is a great way to learn more about disability from a variety of voices, diverse voices, and seeing the ways that currently disability is so poorly addressed by the law. And it really puts a fire under readers to question access. And I think it's so important. I hope they do more installments of it, hearing from more voices and constantly keeping disability at the forefront. And hopefully this causes more books on disability to be published. And I do want to make it a goal for my next year to read more about disability. I have some that I picked up, including one book called Golem Girl, which I thought I was going to get to this month or this year, but I didn't. And so I hope next year, that's my goal, is to read more books on disability. There's also one called Their Plant Eyes, about blindness, that I really want to read. A book I always recommend for people looking for nonfiction. It's so good. We have 3 more. Next up, I have Conditional Citizens by Laila Lalami. This is another book that I think is underread and I learned so much from. It's all about, of course, citizenship and how immigrants are treated as conditional citizens, particularly those that are people of color and minorities. Laila Lalami looks at different topics within citizenship, namely faith, assimilation, amongst many, and really examines the ways that the arbitrary rules around citizenship are for the benefit of white supremacy and really unpacking what that means. And citizenship is something that I hadn't really examined or thought of too much as, a U.S. citizen myself. It's just something I hadn't really read too much about. And I'm so glad that I did, because these are issues that I think are so necessary to consider, and really thinking of the ways in which white supremacy kind of employs certain ways to restrict the rights of people that are not necessarily explicit, and really unpacking the ways that white supremacy is so ingrained. So this is the book that I took so much away from. I underlined the shit out of this book. It was incredible. I do think that while this book is very bleak and looking at how white supremacy is so ingrained in our society, I do think Laila Lalami, particularly in the last essay, really examines how there is still hope in terms of erasing this idea of conditional citizens and having equal citizenship under the law. And I love that she held that sense of hope, as a lot of the collection is quite bleak. But I do think overall you should absolutely read this book. It's a must read, and it needs to be read more, I think. So, and last but not least, I have my 2 favorite nonfiction books that I read this year. First one is The Right to Sex by Amia Srinivasan. This book is all about feminism in the 21st century. And I will say that these last 2 books, I'll just name them, The Right to Sex and the George Saunders book called To Swim in the Pond in the Rain, they both, I think, hold a special place in my heart and really spoke to me because they feel like conversations. And I found that I think that my favorite nonfiction, particularly when you're trying to learn something from it, is when it kind of feels like you're in a classroom, which is weird. Like I feel like I've always loved being a student growing up. I was a student for most of my life, from 5 to 23. Is that right? Never took any breaks. And I just really enjoyed being a student overall. And I kind of miss it in certain aspects. And so I think these 2 books really brought back that joy of being in a classroom and trying to parse through your thoughts on certain things, and really challenging you as a reader to think about your own examinations of things. And so first, I'll go into The Right to Sex. This is a book about feminism and many specific topics underneath it. So Amia Srinivasan looks at pornography, about sex and carceralism in regards to prostitution, about professors sleeping with their students. And so these are all really dicey topics, I would say. And I really found that my brain was just expanded while reading this book. I think, for example, in one of them about pornography, she talks to her students about their thoughts on pornography and whether it is good for feminism, or whether, a more dated, I guess, form of feminism is considering porn as, terrible for women and only objectifying them, or is it a means for empowering them to engage in sexual conduct in any ways that they see fit and making money from it. And she was kind of surprised to see that a lot of her students felt that pornography is a pure objectification of women for the benefit of men. It's kind of a through line in a lot of these essays, is how Amia Srinivasan kind of balances these different perspectives and various waves of feminist thinking, trying to figure out through all of these different lenses what her own thoughts are. And often I've seen a couple critiques of this book saying that people wish that she actually came to a conclusion in her essays, but I actually appreciated that she didn't. what the benefit of a book like this is to just open your mind to more perspectives and really examining how you approach your thoughts on feminism, and whether that's a proper way of doing it or whether you can see topics through a new lens, and how that informs, even if you don't change your mind on a certain topic, making sure you consider other topics and how your own biases kind of impact where you land on certain issues within feminism in particular. It feels so tight and well researched and reported, but it also feels very exploratory and also just like quite gorgeous to read. She just seems such a smart person and really is engaging with these issues in such a meaningful way that I just loved my reading experience, while also learning so much, and thinking about these questions was just really fun, for lack of a better word. I mean, these are often, quite grim topics that we're considering, but Amia Srinivasan really makes it this engaging discussion that you have with yourself while reading this book. I want to push this into everyone's hands. I think it's so, so good. And I want to find more nonfiction in this vein. It did it for me. And that leads me into my favorite nonfiction book of this year. I've talked about it on my channel numerous times already, so I apologize if you watch me frequently or if you've seen me talk about this, but I have to give a recommendation again for A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders. This one I would say even more so feels like you're in a classroom learning from George Saunders. He's a professor at Syracuse University, and he's basically distilling a creative writing course into this book about the various Russian authors that he thinks are excellent writers of short stories and Russian literature. And so he gives you a grouping, a sampling of Russian short stories from different writers. The general format is that he gives you the story and then he follows it up with an essay and makes you question everything that you just thought about the story, and really examining how you approach reading the story, what you missed, what you identified, what you liked about a story, what you didn't, how a story escalates, how the author uses causation to get to the next point, how a writer omits certain things to make the short form more effective for the reader. All of this is so rewarding for, one, I would say writers. I think this is a must read if you write stories or novels, understanding how intentionality and revision are so necessary to the crafting process. I'm not a writer myself, but I have played with the idea of maybe writing one day. And this will be a book that I constantly go back to understand craft, really just be, more self-critical of how I would approach writing, but also just as a reader, being able to, also give my opinions online about books. I felt like a way more informed reader by the end of reading this book, and really approaching particularly short story collections with a more intentionality, and really examining, why is the writer starting here? Why are they ending here? How did they get from the beginning to the end, and what kind of caused the story to go where it did, and why did I not like the story versus why did I? And while it might seem kind of dry to read, I can assure you that it is not. This is one of the most fun books I've ever read. It was so engaging. It made me feel like warm and fuzzy on the inside reading this book, because I just felt like I was learning so much, and I just felt like I was in the hands of this, like, the coolest teacher. Like, when you were in, I don't know if you had a good English teacher. I had a couple good ones, and this just brought me right back into AP literature with one of my favorite teachers, and just talking about books. And while I'm not, verbalizing with George Saunders, he really engages with you in a way that makes you feel like you're having a conversation with him through questioning your own thoughts about things. And so this is a book that I think everyone should read. I think people will get different levels of enjoyment. If you don't really want to work at something while reading, I think this book, save it for a time when you want to really take your time with a text. But I think it is so, so, so rewarding to read. It's such a treasure trove of just brilliant insights and reflections, and will make you a better reader and a better writer. And I think everyone can learn something from it. So that's my #1 favorite of the year. I hope you liked this video. Let me know what your favorite nonfiction book of the year is. I would love to know. But anyways, I will catch you in the next one. Bye.